Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. We're joined, as always, by Doctors Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. And today we are doing a study or a mini study of the Battle of Fontenoy. So this episode is airing on the anniversary of that battle. So I think, first off, we need to kind of get an idea of where this battle is actually fought. So Andrew, if you could kind of give us location, kind of starting where in the world are we, and then narrow it down to where exactly this battle takes place.
Yeah, sure. So the battlefield is in what is now Belgium, what was then the Austrian Netherlands. More specifically, it's near the city of Tournai, which is kind of the point of the battle. We'll come back to that later on. Tournai is on the River Scheldt, which flows roughly northwards into the North Sea, and Fontenoy is on the eastern bank, the other bank, a little bit to the southeast of the city.
And then the actual battlefield itself, is there anything we should know specifically about that field to help us understand the events?
Very basically, it's if you think of the front lines as an L shape, you're not going to go far wrong. So there's a north-south front, which is essentially where the British and the Hanoverian contingent of the Allied army is deployed, and then there's an east-west front where the Dutch contingent is deployed, facing obviously the French defences in both cases. The village of Fontenoy is at the angle of the L. The north-south bit stretches up towards a quite large wood called the Bois de Barry, and then the Dutch front stretches back towards the Scheldt, and the French end of that is anchored on a town called Antoing, which is just off the river. So that's the basic position. The French are all behind and inside the angle of the L.
Now that we kind of know where we are, can you describe kind of the situation briefly? So this battle takes place during the War of Austrian Succession. Can you give us just a brief background about what this conflict's about?
Can you do the Austrian Succession briefly? Probably not. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. So the Austrian Succession is who's going to succeed Karl VI as Holy Roman Emperor. Is it going to be Is it going to be his daughter's husband, or is it going to be the Elector of Bavaria? That part of the war is kind of done with, not least because the Elector of Bavaria is dead by this point. So it's now degenerated into the usual France against Britain and the Habsburgs conflict, which has been a recurring theme of Europe for the last 60 or 70 years. By this point, we're in 1745, of course. It's a bit of a more complicated situation because there's the wild card of the Prussians being involved this time. So the Austrians are at this point largely distracted by dealing with Frederick the Great. So there are only a handful of Austrian troops in the Flanders front for this campaign. But that's essentially the political background. The French, as part of, as I say, this on and off struggle that's been happening since the days of Louis XIV, the French are looking to push into the Austrian Netherlands in the first instance, and then potentially into the Dutch Republic itself. The Dutch it's one of these weird 18th century things. The Dutch are technically neutral, but they're in the field as auxiliaries, and they're garrisoning the barrier fortresses that cover the approaches to the Netherlands. One of which is Tournai, and the French army, commanded by Maurice de Saxe, Marshal Saxe, but accompanied by Louis XV, who very wisely lets the professional do the actual generalship bit. As I say, is looking to advance, and particularly is looking to capture Tournai, not least as an end in itself, to break through this belt of fortresses, so they can carry on the advance without leaving a fairly sizable Dutch garrison in the rear, but also as a means to bring the Allied army, the Pragmatic Army, into battle fairly early in the campaigning season. So de Saxe quite innovatively perhaps realises that if he can inflict a heavy defeat on the Allies, he's then got the best part of the summer to mount a major advance before the autumn weather closes things down and the campaigning season comes to a close. So, in a sense, Tournai is an objective in itself. In a sense, Tournai is also bait to draw the Pragmatic Army out from its garrisons around Brussels and into a pitched battle at a pretty early stage in the campaigning season.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. There's a succession for the Austrian throne, and there's two options. France is on the side of who again?
So France was backing the Bavarian candidate, who is briefly elected emperor, but he then very inconveniently dies. So France has got involved in this war. In a sense, the point for France being involved, or the excuse for France being involved, is now null and void. But as I say, it sort of ties into this Franco-Habsburg, Franco-British conflict that's been going on since Louis XIV's time. It's all about France expanding now. That might be through acquiring a grateful client on the Habsburg throne, on the Austrian throne to replace the Habsburgs. Well, so that lasts for all of about a year.
And then that's when you have the British supporting the Habsburg.
So the British come in as auxiliaries of the Austrians, and then as direct belligerents. It's horribly mixed up. I mean, there's an Anglo-Spanish colonial war going on at the same time, which again kind of gets subsumed. That there's Prussia and Austria in Silesia that again gets subsumed. It's a real sprawling. I mean, people say the 7 Years' War was the First World War. I would argue you could probably say that for the Austrian Succession if you argued it the right way. It's a big messy conflict with quite a few sides, quite a few people changing sides at different points to really complicate things in the early stages.
Wow. Just to make things more difficult for us however long later, right?
Yeah, this is it. I mean, American independence, nice and easy. That's an obvious goal, isn't it? But yeah, the early stuff, the cabinet wars, it's all, devious politicking. But as I say, in a sense, that's almost irrelevant to the battle. It's become a straightforward power struggle by this point in the war, and that's the way the French are playing it. Awesome.
And so we talked a little bit about some of the events that are leading to the actual battle, because this battle is not in the beginning of the war. It's a little further on, correct?
So again, we'll see if we can sort of leave the German and Italian and other theatres of the war, but essentially in the Northern European, in Flanders theatre, the British are initially involved in the fighting in Germany in 1743, Battle of Dettingen, but for the most part they're deployed as part of what's called the Pragmatic Army, Pragmatic Alliance being the sort of pro-Habsburg alliance to support what was called the Pragmatic Sanction, this agreement that Maria Theresa and her husband would succeed, which, as I say, again, is kind of irrelevant by this point, but that's why it's called the Pragmatic Army. As well as the British, it's composed of Hanoverians and Dutch and Austrians, although, as I say, for this campaign, most of the Austrians have gone off to fight Frederick the Great, so there's a few cavalry regiments, there's not many Austrians there. There's been a campaign the previous year, 1744, de Saxe with a fairly small army, because the main French effort is down on the Rhine in that year, and the Pragmatic Army under Marshal Wade, who is aging by this point and not especially active, and he and Saxe fight maybe isn't even the right word, conduct a campaign of manoeuvre that never really leads to anything for the whole course of 1744. They're just tying each other up. They're not able to take part in the war anywhere else, but nor are they achieving anything in their own theatre. Wade is then recalled, and we get the Duke of Cumberland appointed to command instead, second son of George II, only 24 years old. So this is rapid promotion. He'd been a major general at Dettingen 2 years previously and been shot in the leg for his pains. That was pretty much his practical experience of command. So yes, he can wave a sword and rally a wavering brigade, but he's now commanding a fairly sizable Allied army and having to conduct strategy and diplomacy and all the rest of it. And as I say, he and his army start the campaign up near Brussels. He's been given quite a few experienced officers to back him up. We can maybe talk about that in more detail when we get down to the armies and who's commanding what. But at the end of the day, you put a fairly headstrong young royal in charge of an army, and he's going to do what he wants to do. So this is to some extent what de Saxe is banking on. If he can lure him into this killing ground that he's trying to prepare around Fontenoy, then he can very much fight the Pragmatic Army on his own terms. One of the interesting things about de Saxe, we talked about him in an earlier episode. He's somebody I'm quite a fan of from the cast of this era. In an earlier stage of his military career, he'd been fighting against the French during the War of the Spanish Succession, and he'd been at the Battle of Malplaquet with Marlborough and Eugene, and he'd seen at first hand the horrific casualties that the Allies took in that battle, attacking French field fortifications, and he realised that that was a way to what would you call it these days? A force multiplier. If you can draw the enemy onto defended ground of your choosing and shoot the heck out of him, then that was a surefire way to win a battle. Whereas 2 years previously at Dettingen, where de Saxe was not present but would certainly have heard about, the French had actually left a very good defensive position to carry out an attack on the Pragmatic Army. And had been soundly defeated for their pains. So I think there was a case of learning from that recent experience and from his own earlier experience in coming up with the plan that he created.
So we talked about de Saxe. Are there any other key leaders with him that are going to become crucial in this engagement?
I think one of the people that gets forgotten, he's got a very good chief of staff, as we would call it these days, which wasn't a term used then, a guy called Cremille. One of the things to be aware of with Saxe in this campaign is he's not a well man. He actually conducts most of it from a carriage rather than on horseback. Alex did slightly unkindly in a previous episode suggest that he was laid low with the pox, which is not improbable. I mean, he was very popular with the ladies of the opera and so forth. But the official diagnosis, at least, is dropsy, fluid retention. But certainly, he was in a lot of pain. He would have struggled to have ridden. So having a good chief of staff was really an essential adjunct to dealing with his health issues. Although he showed incredible personal energy on the day as well. There's a lot of senior brass from the French army there. The king's in the field, so everybody wants to be there and have their moment of glory in front of the king. And actually reconstructing the order of battle can be a little bit difficult because the army is deployed to fit this fortified position. So the conventional deployment with cavalry wings and infantry lines and the rest of it all gets broken up. You get a lot of fairly senior generals left with maybe just a brigade to command. So there's various acts of gallantry by senior men, but there's not an awful lot of leadership. It's a brigade and regimental level battle in many ways.
And that's because the king is there. They want to kind of
exactly. Yeah. I think there's an element of that certainly. And in terms of senior men, I mean, Marshal Maurice, who was defeated at Dettingen, is there as part of the King's suite. Duc de Richelieu, who goes on to greater fame in the 7 Years' War. A fellow called Lowendahl, another foreign-born soldier, Danish in this case, is probably Saxe's most trusted subordinate. He's actually left with a reserve formation in this battle. One of the things, as I say, to bait this trap that he's creating. Saxe actually sort of deliberately leaves detachments from his army in the expectation that he can pull them in time to meet the advance, and he entrusts Lowendahl with one of those. Clement Tonnerre, I suppose, is the only other one, the cavalry commander, who he's. I get the impression that he crops up as quietly reliable in pretty much every account you come across, which for a French general in this era is quite an impressive feat, because it's normally great deeds of personal glory and damn the rest of the army. Whereas, Clement Tonnerre seems a little bit more a sound subordinate, and certainly the cavalry that he leads helps secure the course of the battle, shall we say, as things progress, without giving too much away at an early stage. So that's the French team, if you like. But all under the eye of the king, which is important in itself.
That sounds a little nerve-wracking, to have your boss kind of watching you in the moment.
He's even brought his son with him to show him how a battle's to be fought, the young Dauphin. So you've got
no pressure.
The king, the king and the heir are both there. Yeah, no pressure.
Can you, switching over to the Pragmatic Army, which is awesome. It sounds like a real value statement in a name. Can you kind of describe the key leaders? We talked about the Duke of Cumberland. Kind of describe those key leaders, and then what's that army made up of? Because this is an alliance, so we've got a whole bunch of different people.
Yeah, so it's essentially two wings, like left and a right wing. The right wing is I'll say British, but it's Anglo-Hanoverian effectively. Obviously, the King of England and the Elector of Hanover are one and the same person at this point. So the Hanoverian army tends to fight fairly closely with the British troops. A lot of the Hanoverian contingent, though, for this campaign is actually deployed down on the Rhine. There aren't that many Hanoverians. There's quite a lot of Hanoverian cavalry, a couple of strong brigades, but only 5 battalions of infantry. So most of this wing is British, and it's some of the best infantry that Britain's got. Most of the regiments, a few have been rotated in and out of garrison, but by and large, it's the army that fought and won at Dettingen, which was very much a soldier's battle. So we've got the 3 regiments of foot guards, we've got some of the senior regiments of foot, and the infantry is all under Sir John Ligonier. Again, this tradition of not necessarily taking service with your own national army. Sir John was actually Jean Ligonier, a French Protestant Huguenot, driven into exile under Louis XIV, who ended up taking service with the British and became, I would argue, Britain's best general of this war, and certainly he's part of this sort of more senior, experienced team that meant to be backing up the very young commander. Even more experienced, General Campbell commanding the cavalry. There are so many James and John Campbells, and I'm not going to give the first name because the chances are I'll get it wrong. I think it was Sir James, but there are a lot of Scotsmen in this army. Again, experienced, and then the Dutch contingent under the Prince of Waldeck, and this is so the entire left wing of the army is uniformly Dutch, and the Dutch get the British certainly blame, or Cumberland certainly blames the Dutch afterwards when things have gone wrong. I don't think I'm giving too much away by saying that Fontenoy is a French victory. I imagine most people would know that coming in. So the Dutch get scapegoated, which is a slightly depressing British tendency. They get a bit of blame after Waterloo when things don't go well there, and then we won that one. So imagine how it was in a defeat. Politically, the Dutch Republic's in a bit of a state at this point in its history, and maybe isn't the unified force that it had been in Marlborough's day. And I'll not give too much more away, but we'll see how the Dutch side of things plays out on the field. And then there's, a very small Austrian contingent, which nevertheless has a field marshal in command. Koenigsegg, went blank for a moment there. Field Marshal Koenigsegg, who is there essentially not to command 2,000 cavalry. Clearly, there are brigadiers to do that, but again, he's meant to be some experience to be available for Cumberland to draw on if he so needs it.
And you said Cumberland's only 24 or so when he's taking command?
Yeah.
It's got a lot of pressure for a 24-year-old.
Well, if you're born royal, that's what you're raised and trained for, whether you're entirely ready for it or not.
I guess that is true. So before we get started, can we clarify what the mission of each army is?
So de Saxe obviously wants to capture Tournai. That's the sort of initial objective of the campaign. But as I say, the immediate goal is use that siege to draw Cumberland into a battle and defeat him on ground of Saxe's own choosing. That's the objective. And for Cumberland, it's dead simple. He needs to bull straight through the French army and relieve Tournai. Now it's a head-on job, really. There isn't a lot of subtlety to it.
And before we get started, Alex, is there anything you want to add to our setup to the battle?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed listening. I guess I would say, Lee, could you give us a breakdown? The average 24-year-old in the U.S. Army in the officer class is what, a first lieutenant? Maybe a captain? Probably a first lieutenant, second lieutenant?
Yeah, most likely a first lieutenant. And so by that point, in my experience, they've probably got a deployment under their belt. Depending on the time of their service, that deployment could be a number of experiences. Yeah, certainly not commanding an army.
Yeah, a coalition army composed of multiple nations. Yeah. Do you think that... obviously, Andrew, you've mentioned that Cumberland also has a deployment under his belt, right? He's wounded. It's at Dettingen, right? That he's shot. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. What other elements are there to his military education? I mean, is he studying it in a professional way? Does he have tutors? Has he been to the continent and met any of these European officers that he's fighting alongside before this?
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic 18th century way of training a young royal in the military arts. Really, he's given the colonelcy of a foot guards regiment at a fairly early stage. And
okay, what stage though? What age is he?
Oh,
when he's given a commission.
He must be late. It must be late.
12.
It must be teens, mustn't it? I'm having to think about this now. I'd have to look it up, but he's
because if he's in there at 14, it's not as insane as it would be in the modern context, right? I mean, he's got 10 years of experience in the military.
Yeah, I'd have to check the exact dates, but I mean, certainly he's had a good grounding in regimental soldiering. I think that's probably the way to look at it. He hasn't, other than accompanying his father in the Dettingen campaign, and again, to some extent, seeing how not to do it. I say that battle is won by King George's army, not by King George. He's not had a lot of practical experience of army command or particularly coalition army command, which obviously is a more complex situation again.
And prior to this battle, is there any tension in that coalition?
I say the Dutch are less enthusiastic than perhaps the British would like them to be. They're very keen to maintain strong fortress garrisons, which are fine if you want to hold a fortress, but limit the field army. They also insist that the British meet obligations to put troops into the garrisons, so Cumberland's actually without 4 or 5 of his infantry regiments, one of his cavalry regiments that have had to go and help hold fortresses elsewhere. So that's certainly a difficulty. And then the fact that a lot of the Hanoverian troops and some of the Austrian troops that haven't gone off to fight Frederick are having to be redeployed down on the Rhine. I mean, one of the recent studies of this war, Alistair Massey, who looks at it from a primarily a diplomatic perspective, he actually argues that not only is Fontenoy the deciding moment in the war, but it's the diplomatic issues that deny Cumberland so many troops that he potentially could have had available that are the key factor. You know, if he'd had a stronger army, Saxe's impregnable position wouldn't have been impregnable. The battle could have gone the other way, and with it, the fortunes of the war. I mean, it's a lot to hinge on that one issue. I think possibly he overstates a case in that book, but it's certainly something to be aware of.
So we've got these two armies. One is trying to relieve Tournai. The other one is trying to defend Tournai. Can we just hop right into the execution of this battle? Like, how are these armies being set up? and what actually happens in this battle.
Yeah, okay, so we've got this L-shaped defensive position that the French have established that I mentioned, which is anchored with, say, Fontenoy village at the angle, and that's been palisaded and so forth, and there are gun batteries in there. There are more gun batteries in redoubts between Fontenoy and Antoing. There are more guns again in the open between Fontenoy and the Bois de Barry, going up to the north, and then behind the woods, so to check any troops that might fight their way through the woodland, there are more redoubts with cannon again. What there isn't, although the Saxons seem to have planned for this, maybe is rightly focused on fortifying the key areas, that there isn't an awful lot of fortification, and there aren't an awful lot of troops north of the Bois de Barry. Campbell, who I mentioned, Cumberland's cavalry commander, does actually suggest that at the very least the Allied cavalry, or his Allied cavalry of the right wing, should hook round to the north of the woods, and it's an interesting what if they had, because that could well, the emergence of half a dozen brigades of cavalry in on a fairly open French flank could have been an interesting development. It would certainly have drawn off de Saxe's reserves, but Cumberland decides he wants to keep the two wings of his army united, so they do, as I say, go bulling straight forward against this prepared position. But the thing that opens it off, so the Dutch have got fairly open country, and they sort of shake out into deployment and wait for the right wing to come up. So as the day starts, the Anglo-Hanoverian cavalry is covering the advance of the infantry element of that wing of the army towards, so the north-south element of this L-shaped position. And they realise there are French troops in the Bois de Barry who are going to need clearing in order to cover the flank of the infantry advance. Obviously, you don't send cavalry into woodland to do that, so infantry needs to be brought up, and this is where the fighting opens. So, rather than take a single brigade out of his infantry line, what Cumberland does is draw 4 different battalions from 4 different formations, put them under a brigadier by the name of Inglesby, who's something of a protege of his, or at least has been up until this day, and send them to clear the woodland while the rest of the army deploys. The problem is the French troops in there are the Legion de Grassin. So this is one of the very early light troop formations. A legion because it's all arms. Light infantry, they called them arquebusiers. That was just a term. They were carrying ordinary muskets in a very snazzy fur-trimmed uniform with a lovely Merleton shako and everything that the Comte de Grassin could afford to pay for his pet regiment. And they had some light guns and some light cavalry attached to them as well. But it was the infantry element in the woods, and they severely check Inglesby's attempt to push his infantry through. And as they do eventually fall back, as I've mentioned, there are these redoubts that cover the exits from the woods, and it becomes quite apparent that there isn't going to be an obvious way to push through there. And Cumberland gets increasingly annoyed about this because he's ordered this to be done, and he's a prince. This is going to happen, and it doesn't. And a succession of aides-de-camp are sent to chivvy Inglesby into action, and eventually it's realised that it's not happening, and Inglesby ends up in royal disfavour and disgrace, and there is that sort of scuppers any hope to flank the position through the woods, and it's going to have to be straight up fighting from that point. That kicks off with the Dutch. They go forward on their front between Fontenoy and Antoing, and are checked and fall back. And the British and Hanoverian infantry is still slowly deploying. The cavalry are screening it. Poor old Campbell at this point gets his I think he loses a leg, but whatever it is, it kills him. Certainly, he gets in the wrong way of the cannonball, and that's the end of a distinguished military career. So the cavalry is temporarily leaderless. The infantry takes some considerable time to deploy. It's been a fairly damp spring. The ground's soft. Just getting them up through. There are some little villages on the approach that serve as bottlenecks. And so from Inglesby going forward at about 6 o'clock, there isn't really much serious action on the British part of the front until, the deployment starts about 9, and it's really about 10:30 before they start going forward in any numbers. Some of Inglesby's battalions are brought back round and actually get used against Fontenoy in support of the Dutch, and again checked. As I say, the village has been barricaded, loophole, stuck full of infantry and cannons. It's a tough nut to crack. And so you can't capture Fontenoy, and you can't capture the woods. So the only option is to go straight up the middle, which, as I say, has got French artillery and the French guards, and backed up by all of de Saxe's reserves. And this is the moment that, if anybody knows anything about Fontenoy, they know the story of allegedly the English and the British and the French foot guards, each inviting the other ones to fire first, which I suspect is one of those lovely Victorian myths that have come down and doesn't bear a great deal of resemblance to reality. One of the more believable stories is that a British Guards officer mockingly toasted the French and suggested that this time they stood and fought rather than running away like they had at Dettingen, where they'd famously had to jump into the river to escape. In a sense, who said what to who is probably irrelevant. What does happen is that the British Guards and the rest of the frontline infantry put a pretty tremendous volley into the French, and the bulk of the Garde Française do exactly what they did at Dettingen and break and run, which isn't a great thing to do when you're the monarch's household troops and your monarch is on the field watching. It may be a good thing that the commander of the guards had already been killed at that point when they broke. I cannot imagine his career would have prospered, particularly since it was the same guy who'd messed it up at Dettingen. So the advancing British and Hanoverians push into this, and it's a really narrow gap. I mean, I've walked it. This is a battlefield I've visited. There is not a lot of space between Fontenoy and the woods, and you've got, I do quick maths here, 10. You've got about 17 infantry battalions in the first two lines trying to push into this space. And so what happens almost by default is they end up forming. It gets called a column. It's not a column if we imagine the French in some of Napoleon's battles. It's battalions in line, but you've almost got. It's almost like a giant version of an infantry square, I suppose, in a way, with multiple battalions on each face. So 6 or 7 facing towards the French, and then as they push deeper into the French lines, there are battalions facing out to either side. It's unlike pretty much any other military formation I can think of. And it's forced by circumstances. These are infantry lines having to shape to the nature of things. As I say, so they're pushing on into the French position, but they've still got the grasslands and the woodland redoubts on the one flank. They've still got Fontenoy village on the other flank.
And does this formation it develops as they're pushing further in, or they're starting in that formation and maintaining it?
They're starting off in 3 lines. The third line is the Hanoverians, and they mostly get pulled off into the fighting around Fontenoy itself. So it's the first 2 lines who are the British infantry. And effectively, if you can imagine the left and the right wings of that line sort of coming in and backwards on themselves, so they become the flanks of the formation because the space simply isn't there for them to push forward in a complete line. And in any case, there are angry Frenchmen on both flanks who need to be faced. So it's a creation of circumstances. And this is the point that certainly there are some on the French side who think, well, we blundered this one. De Saxe not amongst them, but certainly there are those who suggest to King Louis that it would perhaps be wise for the future of his dynasty and indeed the safety of his person if he were to withdraw himself to the other side of the river and perhaps have a fast horse in waiting. De Saxe, however, remains confident that victory is still within the grasp. The king, therefore, remains on the field. But there is a need to stabilise the situation, which effectively is done in the first instance by throwing the French cavalry against this infantry column. They don't break it, but they certainly check it, and you end up with a bit of a stalemate situation in some respects. The Dutch have put another attack in on their front, which has been checked. They've pretty much shot their bolt by this point. They put in 2 attacks. Their infantry has performed credibly, but hasn't been able to break through. Their cavalry, I think even Dutch accounts would admit, doesn't have its greatest day on the field. But then again, it's trying to manoeuvre against infantry behind fortifications, which is not really what cavalry is meant to do. The Anglo-Hanoverian cavalry isn't able to come into action on its front either. So from the Allied perspective, it is largely an infantry battle. And the British infantry has fought its way into the middle of the French army and is now essentially stuck. It can't go any further forward. It isn't inclined to retreat, and it presents Saxe with quite a challenge as to how to get it out. But as I say, because he's bought himself some time throwing in these cavalry charges, he's been able to bring up his reserves who are deployed between the main battlefield that we've been talking about and Fontenoy itself. Some of the first to go into action are the regiments of the Irish Brigade, which I talked about in an earlier episode. A couple of those are lightly engaged early on, and then the whole brigade gets put in, 6 battalions as an attack against the northern flank of the column. The Normandy Brigade as well, infantry brigade, comes in on that front, and then the elite of the French cavalry, the Carabiniers, and the Maison de War, the King's own household troops, the Gardes du Corps and the Musketeer and so forth, are thrown in, and none of this breaks the British infantry. This is one of those battles that Britain classifies as a glorious defeat because great valour was shown, even though the day did not go in Britannia's favour. And all right, I'm biased to some extent as a Brit. I'm also a self-confessed De Saxe fan who used to reenact the Irish Brigade, so I'm sympathetic on both sides. But it's one of those moments where British infantry knuckles down and does what British infantry does best, which is stand its ground, fix its bayonets, and die bloody hard. And that's what they do. And they're very slowly pushed back, and in the end, early afternoon, Cumberland realises it's not going to happen. This is not the day in which he becomes one of Europe's great commanders, and he orders the retreat. And I think to an extent the French are pretty glad to see them go. It's been a bit of a bloodbath in the middle of the field, and the objective has been achieved, but the cost has been considerable. That's Fontenoy as far as the fighting is concerned. The cavalry, I mentioned Campbell and Nichol, General Hawley of Falkirk infamy takes command of the cavalry, and they form a screen behind which the infantry withdraws. The Dutch do the same on their front, and De Saxe has won his battle.
Of all of that, would you say that there's one particular engagement or one action that is really kind of seals the fate of either side, either the victory or the defeat?
Now, this is a can of worms, and it was a can of worms at the time, because every regiment or brigade on the French side was convinced that it was their charge that did the trick. There is, I say, a popular perception in the English-speaking world that it was the Irish Brigade that won the battle. I have a great deal of sympathy for the Irish Brigade. I've written about the Irish Brigade. I've reenacted the Irish Brigade. 6 battalions alone. Yes, they did an impressive charge. They captured a British colour. It was not the colour of the Coldstream Guards, as some accounts would tell you. It was the 25th of Foot. But that doesn't win a battle alone. I mean, you go to Fontenoy, you think the French army wasn't there, the huge monument to the Irish, and there's some little ones to the French. But yeah, the rest of the French army had a little bit of something to do with it. And there's a bit of a pamphlet war after the battle as to who was claiming too much credit, who was being overlooked, and all the rest of it. I mean, I think the best way to see it, that there isn't one single attack that smashes the British column. They do withdraw battered in good order. It's crumbling attacks, if you like. So yes, the Irish put a charge in. Yes, the Maison de War put a charge in. Yes, the Normandy Brigade put a charge in. Before that, the ordinary cavalry of the line put a whole series of charges in that sort of checked the whole advance. So no, that's almost the point. There isn't a single decisive moment, but there are lots of people who after the battle are convinced that their particular unit were the ones who did it.
Do you think that this is sort of the archetypical battle in which the British infantry fight in the way that David Blackmore describes in Destructive and Formidable, where they sort of come quite close and hold their fire and unleash this devastating volley that slaughters a sizable percentage of the Garde Française?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. The Blackmore volley and a charge theory, which I think has a lot to be said for it, and certainly there are plenty of examples where it does fit, and this in the first instance is one of them. But equally, it isn't just a volley, a charge, and the entire French army runs away. They've got, yes, they defeat the Garde Française, but that's one brigade in a fairly sizable army, and as I say, they then have to hold this ground that they've taken, which is continued volleys, bayonets and musket butts, and all the other messy unpleasantness of 18th century warfare.
Yeah, it doesn't sound great for really either side, to be honest. The French come close to losing, the British do lose, but do it well, weirdly. Seems pretty messy.
Yeah, I think messy is probably a good description for most of de Saxe's battles. They tend to go that way. But he's a pragmatist. He's got fairly extensive French manpower resources to play with. So yeah, we're not quite talking human meat grinder, but it's a way to get results.
Yeah, what a way. And so after the battle, could you describe the immediate aftermath? You said the British cavalry provided a screen to allow the Cumberland to retreat. And then briefly, what happens after that?
It's almost, if you think of the Fontenoy campaign as opposed to the Flanders campaign of 1745, that's pretty much it. Cumberland withdraws, is at least able, because so many of his troops have been in garrison, to do a bit of a switch and put some of the most battered regiments into fortress duty to recover and pull out some fresh ones. So he's still got a credible army. Saxe he goes on and completes the siege of Tournai. They actually hold out until June, so that does rather delay this major advance that he's planning, which he is nevertheless able to ultimately mount in the later part of the year. The Allies don't do a great deal effectively to resist that. It's largely a campaign of manoeuvre and then of mopping up by the French some of these Allied garrisons. There's a rather scrappy action at a place called Mel, where Cumberland is trying to throw troops into, and I'm sorry, I forget which garrison he's trying to reinforce, but in all events, they run into the French and get cut up. And then things are rather overtaken by events, because so far as the British are concerned, the Jacobite Rising kicks off in Scotland. Some people would argue that the boost that Fontenoy gave to the French in terms of sort of national morale and stature and so forth was one of the things that helped create the circumstances where the French could support the 45 as a means of distracting British attention away from the continent, and that certainly does happen. And come the end of the year, the French are knocking on the gates of Brussels, and Cumberland's back home worrying about angry Scotsmen.
Does Fontenoy have a real impact on the outcome of the conflict as a whole?
Probably not, but only because of the way the peace settlement works out. So de Saxe goes on, wins more impressive victories, and ultimately conquers most of, conquers the Austrian Netherlands and is on his way into the Dutch Republic. He's up to Maastricht by the time the war comes to an end. The difficulty in terms of the long-term future is that while this has been happening, Britain's been hoovering up French colonies, and so the eventual peace settlement means that if the French want Louisbourg and their various Indian holdings back, then they need to give up somewhere else, and so that's the settlement, and it's back to the status quo ante, which isn't popular in France, I have to say. The bête comme le paix, stupid like the peace, becomes an expression in colloquial French after 1748. I mean, it's said that Fontenoy or Saxe's victories generally gave the Bourbons another generation on the throne. They secure the future of royalist France to stave. I'm not quite sure. Stave off the revolution. We weren't anywhere near the grounds for a French Revolution in the 1740s, so that's maybe overstretching a point. But certainly, in terms of the credibility of the regime, it certainly helps, and the fact that the king is on the field obviously is all chimes into that. And in the shorter term, Saxe is certainly catapulted into the front rank of European commanders, and justly so.
So it doesn't seem like it doesn't give any real tactical effect, but does it? I think you mentioned before it does raise the morale back in France.
Absolutely, yeah, and in the short term, it absolutely has tactical and strategical effects. The difficulty is that they're all given away again come the peace treaty. But yeah, I mean through 46, 47 into 48, the French are continually on the rampage off the back of this initial success, and they win at Racou and Lafelt and Bergen-op-Zoom as they complete that conquest. So then just have to give it all back again.
So I've got another question, and I guess this is for both of you. I think it's pretty safe to say that typically the French military does not have necessarily, at least in a modern context, the greatest reputation. Would you say that Fontenoy is in opposition to that reputation? Because it is a French victory. Could you use it as an example to say, no, actually the French army at this period is very good? Or do you think ultimately it doesn't really benefit the reputation of French arms?
It's certainly not a perfect army. It's a very big army, the French army, and it's got some flaws. It's probably at its, for the 18th century, this is maybe its peak. Certainly by the 7 Years' War, on a unit basis, it's tailed off. De Saxe has the beginnings of an effective staff system. He's able to coordinate detachments of the main army quite effectively. One of the issues, I mean, I've alluded to it in terms of personal glory on the battlefield, but one of the main difficulties with French armies is to get the generals to cooperate with one another, particularly if you're looking at multiple forces acting in succession. If you can intrigue at court and get your rival sacked, then that's nearly as important, if not more so, than defeating the enemy. De Saxe, by and large, because he's got the king's backing, is able to knock heads together and get people to cooperate, or get rid of the ones who won't. That isn't the case in the 7 Years' War, when essentially the same army with some of the same people spends most of the time getting kicked around Europe by just about everybody it fights. So I think Alex is looking disgusted. That's all right. I'm being unfair. They do win some battles as well, but Minden and Rossbach are not shining moments in French military history in the same way that Fontenoy might be. So, De Saxe commands the French army at a good point in its history, and is himself, I would argue, one of the reasons why that is a good point in its history, because he's able to get the best out of it.
Yeah, okay. I guess I would say on like the level of like a Simpsons understanding of history, the French military is not maybe the most impressive military in Europe for much of its history. I mean, if we move past that, I mean, in between us and the events of May 1745, you've the period of Napoleon. I mean, the French actually do quite well in the First World War. It's not as simple, and I'm kind of raising my hands here. This is the French salute, right? I mean, it's not that is not a serious way to engage with the past. I mean, certainly, with the exception of Dettingen, where I would say neither side really covers themselves in a huge amount of glory. The French are fairly successful in the War of Austrian Succession. I mean, they're even successful at some of the later battles in the 7 Years' War. I mean, like, we remember the Rossbachs and the Mindens, but like the Lutterbergs are there too. And, I mean, these are, the French military to some extent knows that it's not doing great in the 7 Years' War. It engaged in a period of intense reform after the 7 Years' War, even before the French Revolution. Some scholars would argue that kind of lays the groundwork for the eventual success under Napoleon. So yeah, I mean, if your view of the French is that they're cheese-eating surrender monkeys, then not much is going to change that. I don't think that level of analysis is necessarily going to give us a great window into what de Saxe is trying to do in the middle of the 18th century. I mean, in some ways, the French military is coming off a series of wins at Fontenoy, right? I mean, they've done very well in the battles of the War of Polar Succession. This is a first-rate European military, maybe not quite on the level of Prussia, but certainly a military that gives the British and their coalition allies a huge amount of headaches in the War of Austrian Succession.
So I think at this point, it's time to go into our Murmurs of the Camp section. And for today, would you guys like to talk about some books about either the Battle of Fontenoy itself or books that might give a little bit more context to the War of Austrian Succession in general?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Fontenoy itself, I've mentioned, I think in a previous episode, there's a fairly good biography of de Saxe by, I want to say White, Marshal of France. Fontenoy itself, there's, from my time with Hellion, there is supposed to be a detailed study by Mike McNally, which has not materialised yet, but he has written a very good Osprey title as a primer, which I would recommend. Although I do hope, come on, Mike, if you're listening, get the detailed book finished because I want to read that as well. There's a French equivalent of Osprey. I've just picked the copy up here. The Histoire et Collection did a Fontenoy book by a guy called Denis Gandilion, and as I say, I have to have that in front of me to remember the name. Again, just called Fontenoy, which is very good from a French perspective. The translation into English perhaps isn't the best, but it's certainly one you can follow, and in terms of redressing the myths about the French army that we spoke about, it's very much a look from that side of the battlefield, which is it's quite refreshing in an English language text. And there's the Alistair Massey book, of course, about the diplomacy and the political background that I mentioned as well, which is called Britain and the Defence of the Low Countries.
If you're looking for a wider background beyond that, I'd probably recommend M.S. Anderson's The War of the Austrian Succession. It's a short and approachable volume. If you're a listener in the UK or the United States and you think, oh my gosh, I've never even heard of this war, what on earth are they talking about? That would be a great place to start. And even he gives some analysis that rewards even people who've spent a long time studying these conflicts. And he's, I think, in my mind at least, the first scholar to make the point. The War of Austrian Succession is actually the largest troop concentrations that we see in European history before the Napoleonic Wars. There were more troops sort of concentrated in Flanders We're talking like 120,000 men armies. There's more men there than in the 7 Years' War. So to Andrew's point, the War of Austrian Succession should be, considered a world war, perhaps on the level of the 7 Years' War, at least a conflict with global dimensions. It's also worth saying, in terms of the size of armies, it also doesn't get bigger until the Napoleonic period, much like and I'm going to disappoint some of our listeners here, I'm sure, much like the relationship between World War I and World War II, in which many Americans view World War I as sort of the red-headed stepchild of the world wars, less interesting. The War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War are both very vital conflicts in the mid-18th century. It's not like, the War of Austrian Succession, good thing we can get through the prequel, now let's get on to the main event, the 7 Years' War. They're both very, very important conflicts to fully understand this period.
Awesome. Well, I think that's great. Thank you very much, guys. And to all our listeners, I guess, have a happy Fontenoy Day. I don't know if that's something we'll start coining. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all again in our next episode.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps and we'd love to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford, produced by Lee Gugino. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.